Good evening. Thank you for coming. I'm Dina Woodall, the Associate Curator for Prints and Drawings at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston here. Tonight we preview a remarkable exhibition, Michelangelo and the Vatican, Masterworks from the Museo at Real Bosco di Capodimonte in Naples. Many of the 41 works in the exhibition come from the renowned collection in Naples. And the exhibition is organized by the Museum of Fine Arts Houston with the collaboration of the Capodimonte Museum, with a few additions from the Vatican, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the University of Chicago Library, private collections, and our own collection here at the Museum of Fine Arts. I also wish to thank the Hamill Foundation for being our lead foundation underwriter. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, David Bomford, as our speaker to introduce this remarkable exhibition. Together, David and I have curated this exhibition and worked on it for the last 9 months, a relatively short period of time to create such an exhibition. David Bomford is the Chairman of Conservation and the Audrey Jones Beck Curator of European Art at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. He has been a distinguished figure in conservation for 40 years, serving as Senior Restorer at the National Gallery London and Secretary General of the International Institute for Conservation. From 2007 to 2010, David was Associate Director for Collections at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles and served as an Acting Director of the Getty Museum during 2010 to 2012. He joined the museum here in November 2012, serving two aspects, as noted by his title, the Head of Conservation and Curator in charge of European Painting. This spring, 2018, he also is the Edmund J. Safra Visiting Professor at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and is traveling often in between these two cities. I must also remark, it's great fun to also travel with David, as we did, traveling to Naples last summer. But now, please join me in welcoming Dr. David Bomford as our speaker to introduce you all to Michelangelo and the Vatican this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina, very much. This has been a wonderful show to put together, and our colleagues here in the museum have done a marvelous job in installing it. And those of you who've seen it will know that already, and for those of you that haven't, there will be an opportunity to see it after this lecture. The collection that we have borrowed most heavily from is the Capodimonte Museum in Naples, and for those of you that don't know it, it is a royal palace on a hill overlooking the Bay of Naples in the most sensational position, and it has one of the great collections of European art inside its walls. And the gallery shot below shows two of the pictures that are in the exhibition, the Titian of Pope Paul III there, and the Raphael's portrait of Pope Paul as a younger man on the right-hand wall. The two characters we are most interested in this exhibition are Michelangelo on the left and Pope Paul III on the right. They are more or less contemporary with each other. Pope Paul was born about 7 years before Michelangelo, and Michelangelo lived on about 15 years after Pope Paul's death. But they were more or less contemporary and struck up this extraordinary relationship in Rome at the beginning of the 16th century, which led to some of the great artworks in Rome being created. What I propose to do in this lecture is to fill in some of the historical background which lies behind this extraordinary collaboration. And I'm going to have to teach you a little bit about the history of the popes, because you cannot understand art in Rome without understanding the succession of the popes. And our span of years runs from Pope Sixtus IV, which you see upper left, to Pope Paul III, lower right. And not only do I want you to memorize the popes from number 212 to 220, but I want you to look at their surnames, and that is very important. So Sixtus IV was a della Rovere. Alexander VI was a Borgia. Julius II was another della Rovere. Leo X was a Medici. There's this strange Dutch pope creeping in here. But Clement VII was a Medici, and Paul III was a Farnese. And those families matter, because in Italy at this time, and especially in Rome around the papal enclave, there were tremendous rivalries and blood feuds between families. And even in this small selection of popes, we have extraordinary rivalries going on. For example, the della Roveres basically hated everybody, but they especially hated the Borgias, and they especially hated the Medici. And the della Roveres supported something called the Pazzi conspiracy in Florence, whereby Lorenzo de' Medici's brother was killed. So the Medici popes and the della Rovere popes were at daggers drawn, literally. Our Pope, Alessandro Farnese, Pope Paul III, was especially related in a curious way to the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, because Pope Paul III's sister, Giulia Farnese, La Bella Farnese, was Alexander VI's mistress. And so Alexander VI, because he wanted to please his girlfriend, made Alessandro Farnese a cardinal. So there are all sorts of complicated interactions going on between these great families and between these popes. If you add in the pressures that the popes were under from European history, the King of Naples, the King of France, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, there were wars and invasions going on all the time that these popes were reigning in Rome. So it was a time of great tumult, great events. So let's start up here with Sixtus IV, who begins our story. And this is a wonderful painting. It was a fresco. It's been transferred to canvas by Melozzo da Forli of Sixtus IV, who we see on the right here, appointing Platina, the kneeling man, as a prefect of the Vatican Library, and it's painted in 1477. If we look a little closer, we can see that Sixtus IV is actually seen not only with the librarian, Platina, but with 4 nephews. And this was nepotism to a great extent. If we go from left to right, we have Giovanni della Rovere, one of the nephews, Girolamo Riario, and then Giuliano della Rovere, who became Julius II. So he is the nephew of Sixtus. So there are the 2 della Rovere popes, one already appointed pope and one will be appointed later. And there is another nephew there. Della Rovere means oak tree. And so everywhere you see a della Rovere pope, whether it's Sixtus or whether it's Julius II, you see oak leaves and acorns. It's a clue. And so if you see a chair with acorn finials on, you know it's probably going to be sat in by a della Rovere. Sixtus was the pope who founded the Sistine Chapel. And if we look at some views of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, both the old basilica, which was built in the 4th century AD by the Emperor Constantine, and the newer buildings, we can see where the famous Sistine Chapel is located. So this is the old Basilica of St. Peter's. It consisted of a very simple church there with a courtyard in front and a loggia in front which was used by the Pope to bless the populace. Here is another view of it. Here, it's the same church with the slightly different details. But over here, we have something called the Capella Magna. It was a chapel that had been there quite a long time before Sixtus, but Sixtus rebuilt it as the Sistine Chapel in 1473 to 81. And this is what the outside of the Sistine Chapel looks like now. And if we look at St. Peter's in modern times, we can pick out the Sistine Chapel just there. So that is where it sits in relation to St. Peter's as we know it today. So that is a rather dull-looking building from the outside, which doesn't really indicate the glories that are inside it. So here is the inside of the Sistine Chapel shortly after Sixtus commissioned it and the decorations that were to go inside it. You can see that the ceiling is as yet untouched by Michelangelo's hand. It's a blue ceiling with stars, and that was how it was until Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But you can see along here, there are all sorts of scenes. On this wall, it's scenes from the life of Christ, and on this wall, it's scenes from the life of Moses. And if you look at the bottom here, there are fictive draperies hanging. These are painted, but they look as if they're actual draperies. And on the end wall here, there is a Perugino Assumption of the Virgin, which has Sixtus portrayed as the donor of the painting. Now, this is the wall where the Last Judgment would be painted in the next century. And that Last Judgment was commissioned by Clement VII, a Medici, and he took great delight in covering up the image of Sixtus IV della Rovere. So there are all sorts of shenanigans going on inside the Sistine Chapel, but this is how it looked shortly after Sixtus commissioned it. So here is a present-day view of the life of Christ going along that north wall. And in any other setting, every single one of these frescoes would be the greatest masterpiece you had ever seen. But because you've got the Last Judgment and the Sistine Chapel ceiling surrounding them, people simply don't notice that these are absolutely stunning paintings. And here, for example, is the great Perugino Consignment of the Keys, painted in 1481-2, shortly after the Sistine Chapel was built. If you look down here, there's a painting which doesn't really match these other paintings, and it's quite interesting for the purposes of our exhibition because it shows this rather odd resurrection of Christ by a man called Hendrik van den Broek, who was an associate of Vasari, a later painter who worked around the Sistine Chapel and wrote the life of Michelangelo. And by a wonderful coincidence, we have a painting by Hendrik van den Broek in our exhibition upstairs. But I'll return to that a little bit later. But the coincidence of those two paintings by the same artist was something I felt I should point out to you. The next Pope of interest to us, of course, is Della Rovere's nephew, Pope Julius II. And here he is painted in 1511 in a great portrait by Raphael in the National Gallery, London. And here he's quite elderly. He's 68 years old here, and he was known as the warrior pope, and in fact he was extremely aggressive and warlike in his younger years, but here he looks anything but a warrior. But you can see the acorns, the Della Rovere symbol, and it's said that in order to become pope, he, many years before, he was elected in 1503, he tricked Cesare Borgia, the son of Alexander IV, into voting for him by promising him lots of money, which he never paid. And so the rivalry between the Della Rovere popes and the Borgias continued. And he said that the Borgias, he wanted to cover up every work of art that the Borgias had made, and he wanted their bodies shipped back to Spain. So the hatred between these extraordinary families was intense. Now, we're going to get later on to the building of the new St. Peter's, but it's important to say that in 1506, Pope Julius II was aware that the old St. Peter's Basilica was falling down. It had been there since the 4th century. It was extremely decrepit and crumbling, and he recognized the need for a new basilica on the same site. So in 1506, he laid the foundation stone for the new basilica, and construction on the new basilica continued sporadically after that, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now let's look at the artist, of course, that's the feature of our exhibition. Michelangelo. Here is Vasari's Life of Michelangelo. The first edition was in 1550, and the second edition, in which the woodcuts of the artist's features were included, was in 1568. And Michelangelo was the first artist, living artist, of whom a biography was written in the first edition of Vasari's Lives. So in the 1550 edition, there was Michelangelo's life was sketched up until the present time, and then in the 1568 edition, 4 years after Michelangelo's death, Vasari brought it up to date and included this wonderful image of Michelangelo. Vasari says extraordinary things about Michelangelo in his life, and you can read it online. It is the most riveting read of Michelangelo's life. But he said certain key things near the end about Michelangelo's character. I mean, he describes him physically as a very healthy man, he said, thin and muscular, although as a boy he was sickly. When grown up, he also had 2 serious illnesses. Nevertheless, he could support any amount of fatigue. He was of middle height, wide across the shoulders, but the rest of his body in good proportion. But he said something about Michelangelo's imagination, which I think is key for something we're going to mention a little bit later on. And he said Michelangelo's imagination was so perfect that, not being able to express with his hands his great and terrible conceptions, he often abandoned his works and destroyed many of them. I know that a little before his death, he burnt a great number of drawings and sketches. And the fact that he couldn't, or he felt he couldn't realize the great and terrible conceptions in his mind physically in marble or on in fresco, meant that he failed to finish many of his works of art, and we will see examples of that a little later on. So here is the great portrait of Michelangelo that we have in our exhibition here. The attribution is debated, and it's sometimes called Daniele da Volterra or Jacopino del Conte, who were 2 contemporary painters who are both known to have portrayed Michelangelo, and Vasari mentions both of these portraits in his Life of Michelangelo. And we don't actually know which of those artists painted this. We think it's probably one or the other. And even the curators at the Metropolitan Museum, from where this normally hangs, are in disagreement about which of these artists painted the portrait. We are calling it in the exhibition Jacopino del Conte because that is the attribution it was given in the great Michelangelo exhibition that was recently at the Metropolitan Museum. Now, it is an extraordinary painting, just of a head and a hand, riveting. Michelangelo's broken nose, his famous broken nose, which was broken in a youthful fight with a fellow apprentice in the Ghirlandaio workshop. And he was disfigured for the rest of his life with that deformity. And his left hand, Michelangelo was left-handed, but he taught himself to draw and paint with his right, because that was the way that artists were trained. But the artist of this portrait, whether consciously or not, is depicting Michelangelo's left hand, the creative hand that we know he had originally. Now, this is a very interesting portrait, and I'll just as a tiny little diversion, you can see up here there's a shape going on under the surface of the painting, which is quite mysterious, and people do notice it when they're looking very hard at this picture, and that is because there's another picture underneath. Whether it's by Daniele da Volterra or Jacopino del Conte, we don't know, but it is a Holy Family, and this is the X-ray of it, and you can see the Virgin's face, you can see St. Joseph's face, you can see the Virgin's arm coming down here, and you can see a baby sprawled over there. And if we look at an infrared image, you can see St. Joseph's face and the baby very clearly there. So this is a reused panel, and the artist has simply lightly obliterated the Holy Family underneath and has painted Michelangelo on top. Now, Michelangelo was an extraordinarily precocious artist. Even in his teens, his talent in the Ghirlandaio workshop was noticed. And Lorenzo de' Medici employed him when he was 17 to make sculptures and designs for him. So he was recognized as being a remarkable artist very early on. He traveled to Rome in the 1490s and made this sculpture. He was just 23 years old when he made this, one of the most beautiful sculptures in the world. Extraordinary. He made it for a French cardinal called Jean de Billière, for that French cardinal's funeral monument, which was elsewhere in St. Peter's. And in the 18th century, it was moved from that rather remote area of St. Peter's to the place it now occupies in the immediately on the right as you come in through the main door of St. Peter's. And it is, as you can see there, signed. It's the only signed work by Michelangelo, and it's signed, the legend has it, because Michelangelo overheard some people saying that they thought this sculpture was by somebody else. The other sculptor was named and was given credit for it, and Michelangelo was so indignant that he then sculpted his signature on the band that crosses the Virgin's breast there. And then you can see the Michelangelo Buonarroti is written right there. But of course, for Pope Julius, when Michelangelo came back to Rome after a brief visit to Florence in 1505, he was invited back by Pope Julius to make a tomb, a sculpted tomb. And it was this tomb that was to be a huge problem for Michelangelo for the next 40 years, because Pope Julius wanted in advance the grandest tomb ever made to be in St. Peter's with 40 sculpted figures, and it was going to be an astonishing achievement, but Michelangelo was the only person that could do it. So he came back and he started to design the tomb, and he started to make carvings for the tomb, but it rapidly got derailed by the suggestion that from Pope Julius II that Michelangelo should paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And so there is the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And so the Pope, in fact, allowed Michelangelo to stop work on this monumental tomb and take on the job of painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling instead. And in fact, the Pope was encouraged to do this by a fellow artist called Bramante. Bramante was a rival of Michelangelo, and Bramante encouraged the Pope to ask Michelangelo to paint the ceiling because Bramante hoped he would fail. Such was the rivalry between them. And of course, Michelangelo didn't fail at all. He succeeded triumphantly. Now, when the Pope Julius II asked Michelangelo to paint the ceiling, he suggested something straightforward. He said, how about the 12 apostles? And Michelangelo said, well, no, I can actually do much better than that. I'll do the whole of Genesis, the creation and the fall of man and so on. And so that is what Michelangelo ended up painting. And it's an amazingly complex program. And here, courtesy of Wikipedia, is the plan of Michelangelo's ceiling. So you can see over here is the earliest scenes. God divides light from darkness, the sun and the planets, the water from the earth. God creates Adam, the famous scene that we see there, Eve. Adam and Eve are tempted and the fall of man, and then we get to Noah. And then round the edge we have saints, we have sibyls, and in the body of the fresco we have nude men who are simply decorating the architecture. And of course we have all these lunettes around. It's an extraordinarily complex program, which also includes the ancestors of Christ. I mean, iconographically, it's an extraordinary achievement even to have dreamed this up, then to actually paint it was amazing. So some of the details, of course, we have the creation of Adam, and we have this amazingly dynamic scene. I mean, creation scenes before Michelangelo were very static. Here we have God swooping in to a rather lackadaisical Adam, who is about to get the spark and leap into life. So this is a wonderful conceit of this dynamic creator coming to wake up Adam. And of course, you get all the characteristics of Michelangelo's figures. You get these great muscular figures, which are always twisting in one way or another. He loved to see bodies in a sort of corkscrew style. And then we have God creating the sun and the moon. Again, amazingly dynamic, and the twisting body here in furious action. And then, of course, the fall of man, in which the temptation of Adam and Eve and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden is shown in a single scene, and they're sent on the way by this avenging angel, this extraordinarily fierce angel. And it's said, although I don't believe it, that these are oak leaves, indicating the de la Rovere connection. And then, of course, you have wonderful details in the Sistine Chapel. You have some of the prophets like Ezekiel. Isn't that the most extraordinary piece of painting? You have the inudi, these nude men who are distributed around the architecture. And then you have the Sibyls, who I think are probably among the most beautiful parts of the whole painting. So the Sistine Chapel ceiling was painted, and Julius II then turned to another artist, Raphael, to decorate his rooms in the Vatican. And they became known to later generations as the Raphael stanze, the Raphael rooms. And they were decorated with very famous scenes like the School of Athens. And we have a drawing in our exhibition which relates to one of the other rooms, and that's this room, the room of Heliodorus. This scene here is the expulsion of Heliodorus from the temple. And so Heliodorus is being thrown out of the temple here. And over here we have good old Pope Julius II presiding over the scene. So here he is there. But up in the ceiling of the room of Heliodorus, there are four biblical scenes by Raphael, including this one, which is Moses and the burning bush. And that's a scene from Exodus, where Moses was looking after the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, and he was attracted by this extraordinary sight of a bush burning but not being consumed. And he approached it, and out came the voice of God, telling him to take the Israelites from Egypt and take them back to Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey. And so in this particular scene, Moses is covering his eyes in terror at the sight of this bush with the voice of God coming out of it. And in our exhibition, we have Raphael's original drawing for it, which is an astonishing work. And it is from the Capodimonte Museum, of course. And you can see just what an amazing full-size cartoon this is. And it is a cartoon for that fresco on the ceiling. It's the exact same size and was used to transfer the design from paper onto the ceiling, onto the wet plaster for the fresco. There probably would have been an intermediate piece of paper that was pricked through so that when you dusted your charcoal through the holes to transfer the design onto the ceiling itself, you didn't ruin this beautiful drawing. But we know it was pricked for transfer onto the plaster, because if you look very closely at the hand, you can see all those prick holes, prick marks, where the charcoal, which would have gone through to the second sheet of paper, and the charcoal dusted through. So it's a remarkable evidence of exactly how a cartoon was used for fresco. Now, Raphael continued to work on the stanze, and even after the death of Julius II. And the next pope, and we'll just remind ourselves where we've got to. So there's Julius II. The next pope is Leo X, a Medici pope. So Leo X continued to support Raphael in painting the stanze in the Vatican private rooms. And so the Raphael that we just saw was completed in the reign of Leo X, not Julius II. But Leo X was a Medici pope. His city was Florence, and he sent Raphael back to sent Michelangelo back to Florence in order to work on the Basilica of San Lorenzo. To make the facade for San Lorenzo, which was Leo X's own church, and to design the facade and make it and install it. They ran out of money, and the facade for San Lorenzo in Florence was never built, and if you go there today, it is still without its facade. But what else did Leo X do in the Vatican? Well, he commissioned Raphael again to make designs for cartoons. And here we have just one of the cartoons, the design by Raphael and the tapestry itself. Leo wanted tapestries all around the bottom of the walls of the Sistine Chapel where those fictive draperies had been painted. And so here is just one of the cartoons, which is now in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and it's the miraculous draft of fishes. The cartoon and the tapestry are in reverse to each other. That's the way they're made. But you can see here that in the tapestry, Christ is wearing a red robe with a sort of pinkish reflection. Here, he's wearing a white robe with a pinkish reflection. And the reason is that in the cartoon, the red pigment has completely faded away and left just a white robe instead. Now, those tapestries were made in Brussels. The cartoons were sent by Raphael to Brussels. The cartoons were made, and they were shipped to the Vatican, and they were stolen by Napoleon. All sorts of things happened, but eventually they all came back to the Vatican, and just very occasionally, the Vatican put them out in the Sistine Chapel, just for a few weeks at a time, because they don't want them to be exposed to too much light. So here is one of those occasions when the tapestries were actually hung. Now, let's continue down our list of popes to the next Medici pope, who is Clement VII. And this is Clement VII, painted in 1531. He was pope from 1523 to 1534. And this is a portrait painted by Sebastiano del Piombo on slate, which is an extraordinary medium for a portrait to be painted on. Now, if Clement VII looks a little bit shell-shocked there, he was. And that is because this was painted in 1531, but in 1527, one of the most cataclysmic events in Rome's history had happened, and that is the so-called sack of Rome, when the troops of Charles V, who was raiding northern Italy, got out of control. Clement VII had not been very supportive of the Holy Roman Emperor, and so the troops came and they ransacked Rome, and the population of Rome emptied out, all the artists went away, and it was the most traumatic time for Rome, and took several years to recover. The importance of Clement VII is that he revisited the decoration of the Sistine Chapel and decided that on the end wall would be a Last Judgment. On the altar wall, the west wall, remember, it's the wall where the portrait of Sixtus was, and the Medicis and the Della Roveres did not get on. So he was very happy to cover up the portrait of Sixtus on the end wall. And so he commissioned Michelangelo to design and paint the Last Judgment, which we'll see in a moment, but he died before it could actually happen. And so it fell to his successor, our Pope, Paul III, Alessandro Farnese, to complete the task. So we see Pope Paul III both as an old man in 1543 on the right, and as a younger man as a cardinal, painted in 1512 by Raphael, on the left. And remember, he'd been made a cardinal by his sister's boyfriend, Alexander VI, and he was made a cardinal in his early 20s. It was possible to become a cardinal even before you were trained as a priest, You were made a cardinal as a sort of political gesture, and then you got around to being a priest afterwards. So quite often, cardinals were made in their teens. He at least had made his 20s, but cardinals could be made very early on, and then you learned your priestly duties later. He had also been made the Duke of Parma, and so he was an extremely well-appointed man. Let me just go back. He's also, you mustn't forget the great surges of European history that are going on all over the place. With the Reformation raging in Northern Europe, it was all going on at this time. And this was the Pope Paul III, who excommunicated Henry VIII in England. So you have to remember that there's we're not just talking about Rome here, we're talking about Europe-wide events. So here is the Last Judgment, that commissioned by Clement VII, carried on by Pope Paul III, and here it is on the west wall, the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. An amazing composition, 300 figures or so, and unlike the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which has all these sort of framing elements around which define it, this is like looking out through a window. There are no framing devices. It just seems to carry on past the building, as it were, outside the building. It's an amazing spectacle. So what is the Last Judgment all about? Well, clearly it's about the dead rising from their graves. They're being, these wingless angels here are blowing their trumpets, and all the dead are rising from their graves. And the general scheme of things is that on the left, the elect are rising up to heaven, and on the right, the damned are sinking down to hell. And on the left, they're being, where they need assistance, they're being helped up by angels, and on the right, they're being dragged down by devils. So it's the most terrifying spectacle here. The central figure, of course, of Christ, with the Virgin under his arm looking rather acquiescent, is surrounded by apostles and saints. So you have St. John the Baptist here, you have St. Peter over there with his keys, you have St. Andrew with his cross shape on which he was crucified, you have St. Lawrence with his gridiron here, and you have various other saints and apostles around Christ here. The figure of Christ is based on the Apollo Belvedere, the great Greek statue, which of course was very famous even at this time. So if we look at some details of the elect and the damned, you can see amazing conceptions that Michelangelo has made. For example, here's a figure who's being the subject of a tug of war. There's an angel trying to take him up to heaven, and here's a devil trying to drag him down to hell. Here is a figure being pulled up by an angel with a rosary, and some of the elect just simply float up under their own volition. So it is an amazing scene here. On the right, we have this poor man being dragged down to hell by devils. He's got two, he's outnumbered. And here we have another of the damned being dragged down to hell by a devil, and this angel is not helping him, he's actually beating him down because he doesn't actually deserve to rise to heaven. So in general, we suspect that everybody over on the left side of the picture is going to end up in heaven, and everybody on the right side of the picture is going to go down to hell. While Michelangelo was painting this extraordinary painting, The Last Judgment, there were complaints already as he was working on the indecency of so many nude figures and the lack of decorum of Christ, not shown, it's shown as a sort of muscular Apollo Belvedere figure. And even before Michelangelo had finished, people were coming in to look at The Last Judgment and complaining about its indecent nature. And one of the people that came in to complain was Biagio de Cesena, who was Pope Paul III's Master of Ceremonies. And he said, it's disgusting, it's disgraceful. We can't have such an obscene painting on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. And he complained to Pope Paul III and said, this has got to be stopped immediately. Well, Pope Paul III did not stop it. And Michelangelo got to hear of it. And he immediately included a portrait of Biagio da Cesena as a donkey. So he's got donkey ears. And this serpent is, how shall I put it delicately, biting him in the groin. So Michelangelo got his revenge. But censorship did take place. Michelangelo's work was considered indecent, and it was ordered by a later pope after Pope Paul III to cover up some of the nudity. But fortunately, before that happened, a painter called Marcello Venusti recorded the painting exactly as it had been when Michelangelo painted it. So this is as Michelangelo painted it, with none of the indecorous parts covered up. So we can actually see all these details. If we go back to in the upper part where you have the two arches, Venusti has made it rectangular and has filled it in with God the Father and a dove. And he's also corrected some of Michelangelo's slight misplacements. He's improved it. Venusti was a friend of Michelangelo. He was a collaborator of Michelangelo. And Michelangelo actually saw this painting in 1549 and approved it. So if we compare the two paintings, which of course we can do exhaustively, but we'll just take a couple of examples, we can see how the censorship of Michelangelo's painting, which happened by Daniele da Volterra in 1565, altered Michelangelo's original concept. And so essentially all of the nude figures here have strategically positioned draperies, which make them decent, which of course Venusti has recorded their original state. And if we look at some details, we can see very nice little details like this, where here's the original as recorded by Venusti, which is St. Catherine and St. Blaise. St. Catherine is highly indecent and looks rather startled at St. Blaise coming up behind her, probably slightly naughtily. So in the Daniele da Volterra censorship, Catherine is clothed by Daniele da Volterra, and St. Blaise has his head repositioned, looking away, saying, "Nothing to do with me," he's saying. So that's the sort of change that Daniele da Volterra made. Now, it wasn't just a matter of covering up. Sometimes Volterra chipped away the paint, so it's not possible before he repainted, so it's not possible to recover the painting underneath. And here is another version of the Venusti version and the Michelangelo version of St. Bartholomew. St. Bartholomew's attribute is a flayed skin, because that was his martyrdom. He was flayed alive, and the flayed skin he holds has Michelangelo's face on it, here in the Michelangelo original and here in the Venusti copy. And Venusti has also included a little portrait of Michelangelo at the bottom left of the picture, looking over this man's shoulder, who has the features of Venusti himself. Another great project that was conceived by Pope Paul III and Michelangelo was the Pauline Chapel. And he produced this extraordinary cartoon for two of the figures in the Pauline Chapel, which we'll see in a moment. And this is the largest surviving cartoon for a project that Michelangelo made. It's enormous. You'll see it in the exhibition. It was the working cartoon for this painting, the Crucifixion of St. Peter in the Pauline Chapel, the Pope's private chapel inside the Vatican. So you can see these two figures down here are the two figures in the drawing. And it is a miracle that this great drawing on many sheets of paper has survived to this day. It was collected by a collector called Fulvio Orsino, and who collected other great drawings from the Vatican, and by that means it was preserved, and then it passed back into the Farnese collection. And the Pauline Chapel is still used today as the Pope's private chapel. Here is the Pope on his birthday, celebrating with the cardinals, and there is the crucifixion of St. Peter. St. Peter was crucified upside down at his own request in order to distinguish himself from Jesus, who was obviously crucified upright. Another of the great cartoons we have in the exhibition is this extraordinary Venus kissed by Cupid. And here Michelangelo was not doing a design for himself, for one of his own works, but for other people to use. And this was for the house of a Florentine banker called Bartolomeo Bettini, who wanted to decorate a room themed with scenes of Tuscan love. And so here is the great cartoon, which eventually was painted not by Michelangelo, but by Pontormo. And that Pontormo became the painting, the prime painting from this cartoon. But so influential was this composition that many other painters painted it too. And here are just a selection of them. So there is the Pontormo, the prime painting done from that cartoon. This is the painting we have in the exhibition, Van den Broek, that I pointed out earlier. Here is a Vasari in the Royal Collection, and here is a Torsini from the Galleria Colonna Rome in the installation at the Metropolitan Museum recently. There are 32 versions of this painting, and it was painted over and over again as an extraordinary tribute to Michelangelo's composition. Meanwhile, Michelangelo had all these projects, but he was still struggling with Pope Julius II's tomb. And so we've gone many years past Pope Julius II's death, but succeeding popes encouraged Michelangelo to continue with the tomb design in order to honor Pope Julius II. This is the drawing of the tomb as Michelangelo originally conceived it in 1513, which would have had 40 figures on and been in St. Peter's Basilica. But eventually, in 1545, he kind of gave up and essentially installed this much smaller tomb with a much simpler concept, with one single figure in the center of Moses, not in St. Peter's at all, but in San Pietro in Vincoli. But he had continued to carve sculptures for Julius's tomb, which was going to have nude men, rather like the Ignudi on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And many of them are unfinished, and these are astonishing works of art. You can see that Michelangelo is freeing them from the marble that contains them. Michelangelo said, inside this block of marble is a figure trying to get out. You could conceive the perfect figure inside the marble, and all I've got to do is free it and make it visible. But in these cases, he never finished the carvings. And so these so-called slaves, the prigioni, the prisoners, are a remarkable legacy of Michelangelo's struggle with the tomb of Julius II. And it's said that essentially what he was saying is that the body is the prison of the soul. So that's why they're called the prigioni. Essentially, he was trying to make prisoners for the tomb. Now, while we're on the subject of drawings, that beautiful drawing of Julius's tomb, we have amazing drawings in this exhibition selected by Dina from the collection at Capodimonte and from our own collection. And it's to illustrate the whole business of drawing in the 16th century, both for drapery studies. This is the earliest drawing in the exhibition, for studies of anatomy, for compositional studies, for animal studies, and I just advise you to go up and enjoy some of the greatest drawings you will ever see gathered together in this context. Meanwhile, Pope Paul III was getting older. Here is the portrait of 1545 to 6. He was only a couple of years off his death here. He's with his grandsons. Now, again, he had children as a young priest, as a young man, and so when he became Pope, he had 5 children already and grandsons, and then he appointed them all very nepotistically to various positions in Rome. And so he was Alessandro Farnese. This is Alessandro Farnese, his grandson, who was also a cardinal appointed by his grandfather. This is Ottavio Farnese. And this was a great portrait by Titian, which is also in Capodimonte, couldn't travel here for our exhibition. But it is one of the great Titians in Europe. It's unfinished. The family were not pleased with it, presumably because it made the Pope look so old and wizened. But it was ignored for a century. It just stayed in the Farnese storerooms. And then it was brought out and exhibited again. And it's now one of the great treasures of Capodimonte, the museum, which was in the center of that room I showed you at the very beginning. We're going to finish with Michelangelo, the sculptor. And under Pope Paul III, he was able to exercise his amazing skills as a designer of sculptural and architectural products. I meant architectural projects. So here is one of the ones that he was commissioned to do by Pope Paul III. This is the so-called Piazza del Campidoglio, which is on the Capitoline Hill. And it was just a jumble of old buildings when Michelangelo took it on as an architectural project. And he basically designed very elegant facades for some of the existing buildings. And so he made this beautifully harmonious square. But in fact, it wasn't completed in his lifetime. And the Palazzo Nuovo, which is the palace on the left, wasn't actually completed until the 18th century. And the floor, the pavement here, wasn't actually put in until the 1940s. So this was a very long project indeed, but one of Michelangelo's most famous architectural projects. Michelangelo also worked with Pope Paul III on the Palazzo Farnese in Rome. It had been started by Antonio da Sangallo, then Michelangelo added this extra story and this huge pediment along the top to make it into one of the grandest palaces in Rome. And you can see that each story gets a little bit taller as you go up the building to allow for the perspective and the recession as your eye travels up. On the right, just for the sake of completeness, we have the Farnese Villa in Caprarola, in which Michelangelo played no part at all, but this was a villa started by Pope Paul III as a young cardinal and continued as a great fortress, and you can see that at the bottom here, and continued by that grandson of his, Alessandro, who then built this pentagonal villa on the top. And it is one of the great glories of the country just north of Rome. Meanwhile, St. Peter's was ticking along. And in 1547, Pope Paul III said to Michelangelo, St. Peter's is going nowhere. I want you to take over the architectural planning of St. Peter's. Michelangelo was very reluctant, but was in the end persuaded to do it. And so there's this wonderful 2 decades at the end of Michelangelo's life where he's just engaged on St. Peter's Basilica. And he made, with the carpenters of the Fabrica, models to envisage what some of the features of the new St. Peter's Basilica would look like. And in the exhibition, we have this extraordinary survival. this actual model made by Michelangelo's hands with the help of carpenters. And you can see how rough it is on the outside. But here is the design for that little piece of that chapel there in St. Peter's that we are looking at there. So we know that Michelangelo was making models and making drawings for St. Peter's. Now, St. Peter's then continued sporadically under Michelangelo's direction, and we have a painting by Vasari of Pope Paul III here, looking at the building of St. Peter's. There's not much happening. That's the only new bit. And the old basilica of St. Peter's is still there in the background. It started at the West End and slowly demolished the old basilica as the new one took its place. And so we can see here that the old basilica started to be demolished and the new one is beginning to be built here. And but it's after Michelangelo's death in 1564, it's more or less stopped. There was no progress at all on St. Peter's Basilica. And we have extraordinary engravings like this, which show the remains of the old basilica. That's the loggia that the Pope blessed from. There's the facade of the old St. Peter's. Then looming behind is the new basilica, the new dome of Michelangelo rising up. And when Michelangelo died, it had reached that level. The drum of the dome had been built, but nothing more had happened. And it remained like that for about 20 years, until the reign of the next Sixtus, when he said that this is crazy. You know, we can't just have half an old basilica and the beginnings of a new basilica. Let's please finish it. And so the architects of Giacomo della Porta and Domenico Fontana were commissioned to finish Michelangelo's dome. And so they then got from that drum stage to the final dome in 22 months. Quite extraordinary. And they finished it, and Giacomo della Porta designed this beautiful cupola on the top, which is there to this day. So Michelangelo's dome was finally realized towards the end of the 16th century. Now, but when this was built, some parts of the old basilica still remained, and there was a doubt as to whether they should actually be demolished because they were so precious. They'd been there since the 4th century, and finally an agreement was come to that as long as the floor plan of the new basilica covered the floor plan of the old basilica, then everybody would allow it to be demolished. And so if you look at the various floor plans, here's the old basilica, here's Bramante's plan, which is what Julius II had been working to. Here's Michelangelo's plan for Pope Paul III, and but that was just going to be a round church with the dome on top. And in order to cover the area of the old basilica, we had to have a nave. And so Moderno then designed the rest of the St. Peter's we know today with a nave here, which was completed at the beginning of the 17th century. So here is the history of the plan of St. Peter's in a simple diagram. So by the beginning of the 17th century, the St. Peter's we know today had been built. Michelangelo's dome had been completed by Giacomo della Porta, and it just awaited the huge Bernini arms that sweep around St. Peter's Square, which is how we know the St. Peter's today. We've left the Renaissance behind. We've now entered the Baroque, and Bernini has taken over, and Michelangelo is far behind. But we can't forget the contribution that Michelangelo and Pope Paul III made to the extraordinary achievements of art inside the Vatican. Thank you very much.